Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 5, coming from Exodus 17, the water and the rock from the rock story. So, Israel seemingly has learned nothing from Adam and Eve. Let me try to capture this more by working through some parallels in these stories. But the central column is what we're ultimately trying to get to with each of these. So, on the left side of the screen, Adam and Eve juxtaposed against Israel, and the purple blocks are essentially the same for each one. Key text coming from these stories here to try to show us what I'm trying to prove here, such that with Adam and Eve, clearly Yahweh made them. Divine and supernatural creation here with respect to carving man out of the dust of the earth and then pulling the first woman from a rib from the man's side, right? And doing so to create them in God's image. But essentially, God is acting supernaturally as well through the dead womb of Sarah to bring forth Isaac, and then the struggling issues with infertility with Rebecca, Rachel, and others as well, that ultimately gives rise to these people, such that it's firmly embedded in Israel's descent that God has brought them, made them. He's also, in the context of this story of Exodus, using the same Genesis language, caused them to be fruitful and multiply, such that the land was filled with them. But notice, even though God made them, they rebelled. Both Adam and Eve and Israel rebelled against God. That Adam and Eve essentially in their own stories deify themselves and try to define right and wrong rather than listening to God and discerning what is right by virtue of God's definition in comparison to what the serpent being says. And Israel is testing God. To test God in this sense is for them to say, in spite of all that you've done and how you've manifestly proven yourself to us over and again with abundant supernatural display of your power, we're still wondering, are you with us? Are you really going to provide for us even now? And with Adam and Eve, God provides for them. He causes all the trees to come up in the garden. He makes them all good for food. He does the same thing with Israel. Here they are in the wilderness, and they have no means of providing for themselves as all their rations are gone. And yet, God, as He did with Adam and Eve, is essentially providing for them, not only by raining bread down in the morning, but even providing meat for them at various intervals throughout their story. But in spite of the fact that God feeds them, yet they seek other food, right? Adam and Eve go after forbidden fruit, and yet Israel tests God. In this particular instance, they are wondering whether or not God is going to be with them to bring water. Now, God starts to get a little upset with them at this point because the water test has already been accomplished, right? He brought them out of the desert or out of the away from the Red Sea to the place before they get to Elim. And then when there was bitter water that was unpalatable, undrinkable, God caused through just the simple throwing in of a stick that was nothing more than just a symbolic display of God's power when He changes the constitution of the water such that now it's not only drinkable, but it's sweet water. And then He encourages them, if you will follow me, listen to me, trust me, as Adam and Eve were to do in the garden, then I will not provide or cause to pass upon you the plagues of Egypt. Then He leads them into Elim, where they have 12 springs of water to drink from, right? So they should have known at this point that God will provide water when they need it, but rather they want to test God. Yahweh walked with Adam and Eve. Of course, we see this in Genesis 3. They are accustomed to that at this particular point as He's walking with Israel, right? Because the Lord goes ahead of them in a pillar of cloud by day, fire by night to lead them. But yet, even though God was walking with Adam and Eve, not perpetually every single second of every day in the physical way He was, at that moment when He comes into the garden and they are expecting His appearance, they walk away from God, right? And the same thing with respect to Israel here, right? They seemingly are pulling their hearts back away from Him. Adam and Eve, they stood with the serpent. They made it very clear where their loyalty and allegiance lay when they decided, if this is really what Yahweh is holding back from us, that's what we want. And, uh, you know, He can stuff His kingdom or the idea of it. If we can have this without having to be fully allegiant and subservient to Him, we'll take that any day of the week. And Israel, again, in their testing of God here, they are showing they are also, as Adam and Eve did, holding their heart back from Yahweh. They are not fully giving themselves over to Him. Now, we cannot claim that Israel is ignorant of those stories. They seemingly have a good idea. They know where they come from. Aaron knows that he is a Levite. No one has to demystify that for him. He knows his own lineage. So if he knows he's descended from Levi, we should have every reason to assume he knows of the backstory of where Levi came from, that he's a son of Jacob, who's a son of Isaac, who's a son of Abraham. And of course, they are already practicing the rites of circumcision. So, with that being said, they seemingly want to bring themselves under this covenant. Now, how much more they knew beyond that is beyond us to know or fully reckon, but the idea is that they seemingly have a good idea of those stories, at least up to Abraham. We should have no reason to think they can't go further back to the time of Noah and then Adam. So, with that being said, and maybe even Moses had documents to work from with respect to arranging these Toledoths or these genealogical records and the accounts that follow them, starting with Genesis 1, right? So, all that to simply say, we can't let them off the hook to say, well, maybe they didn't know about the story of Adam and Eve. I think they clearly did, and yet they are still manifestly making the same mistakes. Lastly, Yahweh taught Adam and Eve, right? You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He is laying it down for them so that way they can discern between what he is defining as right, knowing full well he is going to allow the serpent being to enter the garden to test them so that in offering up his alternative truth claim and then outright lie, they will know this is what God has said. To deviate from that is to deviate away from him. Should we do that or not? Well, we know their choice. And then Yahweh has taught Israel, right? At this particular point, he's already showed them through the miraculous manifestation of his presence and power through the plagues, through Moses' own introduction to the people when he comes into Egypt and he says to them how God has met him in the wilderness and spoke to him, gave them three distinct signs: staff into snake, hand turning leprous, then going back to normal, clean flesh, pouring water on the ground, turning it into blood, all this. And then again, plagues. And they now have seen God destroy Egypt through the Red Sea. He has turned bitter water sweet. He has delivered them into an oasis in the wilderness, given them 12 springs and date palm trees to eat from. And yet again, he tells them, if you would just simply listen to me, if you'll carefully obey the Lord and do all that is right. We don't even have to get to the terms of the covenant yet with them at Sinai. They've already heard plenty, but yet they refuse to trust his words, that being Adam and Eve, and corporate Adam here, um, not wanting to lean upon the Lord. Adam and Eve, they trust the serpent instead. And again, Israel trusting their own sinful instincts and choosing to test God, asking, evaluating, are you really with us? Or is it possible you don't have our best interests at heart? So hopefully that's helpful for you. I think it's important for us to continue to lean on these parallels. I know many of these stories up to this point, and I'm not done with it yet, continue to lean hard on Adam and Eve, but you need to see the microcosm of the story of Adam and Eve and how it's spiraling further outward and it's touching more portions of the meta narrative as we go. The ripples in the pond continue to go outward. If we fail to connect these things for our students, they are going to suffer in some way. And I don't think you want that as a teacher. I certainly don't. So it's going to be far more beneficial for us to explain these things because the Jewish contributors to the New Testament, especially Paul, is making so many key connections, especially when he gets into Romans 5 and he's talking about the sin of the man and so forth. Many of us would say, well, yeah, Adam sinned, so he caused death and sin and death to enter into creation. That's simple enough. That's true. But there are many, many more connections and points of connotation there to help us appreciate how Israel factored into the story, where Israel remains in the story, and what Jesus did and why he had to do it. So it enriches the theology behind it all if we're helping lay this foundation for our students. So again, thank you for your time. I will see you in the next session.